The best way to describe myself would be a yo-yoer. My life looked a little bit like this. I'd go through intense bursts of motivation, but then 2 to 3 weeks in, despite my best intentions, it just never lasted. But then I discovered this powerful equation for discipline. By the end of this video, you'll know the exact repeatable formula that you can use to follow through on the things that you say are important to you. Now, quick disclosure, I cannot take full credit for this idea. I recently watched a podcast with Abdaal and Steve Bartlett, where they talked about the challenges that we all face with discipline in areas like health and productivity. Now, during their conversation, Steve introduced a concept called the discipline equation, and I found it to be such a helpful framework for how we approach our goals and intentions. It helps explain why we might sometimes fall short of following through on our goals, even when we started with so much enthusiasm in the first place. So let's take a closer look. The first piece is how much that goal subjectively matters to you. Now, Steve Bartlett introduces this point in the podcast by talking about how he always felt like he should be exercising, but even though he knew objectively why he should exercise, it just never really stuck. It wasn't until the COVID pandemic hit that he really started to understand on a subjective level why exercise was so important. He says that during this time, it really hit him that all of his life was essentially built on the foundation of his health. So his relationships, his business, everything in his world that he cared about. And since then, he has missed a couple of days here and there, but his consistency has been up in the 80-90% versus down in the 20-30% where it was before he had that epiphany. I can relate to the shift that Steve talked about with exercise because the same thing happened for me with my diet. I read a book a few years ago called How Not to Die by Dr. Michael Greger. And that book completely opened my eyes to the benefits of a plant-based lifestyle. It actually spurred me on to eventually go vegan, and I connected my diet on an emotional and an ethical level. So when you connect your habits and goals with things that subjectively matter to you on a personal level, those things become a lot easier and require a lot less discipline. Suddenly, it's not about chasing a six-pack or forcing yourself to stop eating junk food. It's more about living in alignment with your deeper values. So here's a quick exercise. Just think of something that you've been struggling to stick with, and then ask yourself, why does this really matter to me beyond the surface level reasons? And then whatever comes up, write that down because that is going to be your core motivation. But it isn't going to keep you going unless you address this second point, which is the psychological enjoyment you get in pursuit of the goal. Now, you may be thinking, Soph, what does that even mean? Well, let me explain. You can have a strong belief in something and really know your why, but if you hate the process, then it's going to be virtually impossible to stick with. Many of us tend to approach discipline from a position of restriction or lack. We focus on what we can't do or what we're having to give up in the process, and that just makes the whole thing feel like a chore. When I transitioned to a plant-based diet, rather than focusing on what I couldn't eat, I downloaded an app called The Daily Dozen, which tracks your daily intake of whole foods. And using it every day made it feel like a mini challenge. Tracking those small wins really kept me motivated, and it's amazing to me how just turning it into a little daily game for myself made the process of going vegan actually feel really enjoyable and fun, and completely took the stress out of it. This is something that Ali Abdaal talks about in his book, Feel Good Productivity, which is really all about focusing on making your goals feel more enjoyable and rewarding. So if we stop obsessing over the end result and actually find enjoyment in that process, then we're far more likely to stick with that thing. When the process itself becomes the reward, then the outcome is essentially the cherry on top. So for example, could you pair your cleaning schedule with your favorite music or a podcast? Could you turn meal prep into a mini challenge or a game? Could you create small rituals like a cup of herbal tea while you're reading in the evening? Knowing your why and making the process enjoyable will make a huge difference. But even with these in place, your progress can still get completely derailed if you ignore this last piece of the puzzle, which is psychological friction motivation you experience in pursuit of the goal. During my phases of motivation, I would always wake up ready to eat well, exercise, or work on my personal projects, but somehow things always seem to get in my way. Minor obstacles suddenly became big things, like my gym clothes would be in the wash, or I hadn't prepped my meals in advance. When tasks that should have been simple suddenly required all this extra effort, my consistency would just completely crumble. I think it's really easy to underestimate how much these small barriers can add up. So for example, when I was trying to wake up earlier in the mornings, I would set my alarm for 5 a.m., but I would have to walk across the really cold floor in the kitchen to make my coffee. It sounds like such a ridiculous and small thing, but sometimes that would literally be the difference between me getting out of bed or not getting out of bed. So something that I did to make it easier for myself was just to make sure that my slippers were placed right at the side of the bed and that my clothes were on the radiator ready for me. And these tiny changes really transformed my whole routine. This is really what it means by psychological friction. Whenever you reduce friction, you're essentially stacking the odds in your favor. This is why it's so important to make good decisions as effortless as possible. Your environment really can make or break your consistency. James Clear said it best when he said, "You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems." Making things more prominent in your daily environment will encourage you to do them more consistently. For example, you could keep your guitar out in the living room if you want to practice more. You could put a fruit bowl on the coffee table if you want to eat more fruit. Or you could keep a book on your bedside table if you want to read more. So by intentionally designing your environment and routines to limit friction, you make your goals far easier to achieve and your habits much more likely to stick. So to recap, get clear on why your goal subjectively matters to you. Find ways to enjoy the process. And finally, remove any obstacles to make following through easier. Discipline isn't about willpower. It's about aligning with what matters, enjoying the process, and building systems to support you. And by the way, none of this is about perfection. I think we all have this tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater when something doesn't go to plan. But shifting from that all or nothing mindset to a little and often approach is going to really help. These are the mindset shifts you need, but for the practical tips to put everything into action every day, check out my next video where I share 7 tips that completely transformed my to-do list.